Hello and welcome to the Goot Reaction. I'm your host, Joe Goot, and I'm here this week with my main man from the Midwest, as always. We're discussing identity, both internal and external. We've got a lot of great examples to share with you, some deep dive conversation about things from gender identity to dissociative identity disorder, legal ramifications, all sorts of different takes on identity and how it shows up in our lives. So thanks for joining us, and let's get on to the show. All right, hello everybody. Today we're going to be talking about identity, which is a really broad topic, but we're going to focus on internal versus external identity particularly, and then give a lot of examples. And I really wanted to start with the example of the ship of Theseus, which is an ancient philosophical thought experiment from Plutarch. From Wikipedia, they basically say that in Greek mythology, Theseus, who was the mythical king of the city of Athens, he rescued the children of Athens from King Minos after slaying the Minotaur, and then escaped onto a ship going to Delos. Each year, the Athenians would commemorate this by taking the ship on a pilgrimage to Delos to honor Apollo. So the question is then, over time, is the ship of Theseus still the same ship if every single piece of the ship was replaced? So every time they took it out on a voyage, every year, and they had to repair it over time, and they just removed and replaced piece after piece after piece until there was nothing left of the original. And so is the identity of the ship still the ship of Theseus? And so one of the main ways to look at this is that constitution itself is not identity. And so the most common solution to this thought experiment is that the components that make up the ship and the ship itself are not the same thing. And really, it's only that they occupy the same space at the same time. And so when we consider personal identity, this solution would mean that the brain and the body are separate from the mind and simply exist in the same vessel. So that's the most common way to look at it in terms of philosophical interpretation. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
All right. Well, I wasn't expecting to have to process so many words I hadn't heard before and, right within the intro. But, it's an interesting thought process. I've thought about that when, I see, I'm gonna dumb it down a little bit here, but like when I watch some of these car shows and I see guys, they're rebuilding a, old Camaro or something, and they strip it down so much, put a brand new crate engine in it, build new exhausts and build everything out to where it's such a, granted the shell, the body is there, but you're really still driving a 1967 Camaro, or you're driving a 2024 completely rebuilt version of that. And so what are you actually driving? So it's interesting that you started with that. I think it's, I guess that question maybe comes down to, like, when you kind of mentioned that the pieces aren't, the pieces are all individual pieces, but it makes up a thing. So it really kind of comes down to like an idea in a way of, if people occupying that ship identify with that ship as an idea and what it means and what it's used for, and then it kind of, in a way, it seems like it still is what it always was then, right? If it wasn't originally identified as the sum of all those pieces that made it up, then as you replace those pieces, then it seems like that really doesn't matter, right? Because it was originally an idea and it's still an idea. And so I think it kind of, I would argue it remains what it is, I guess.
Yeah, that's interesting, because in that case, it's almost more of a symbol rather than the thing itself. Is the symbolic nature of it, the original idea of it, is more important than the actual elements that make it up directly. So because you went there, I'm going to skip over something called the continued identity theory and go right to cognitive science and how that interpretation relates, because I think that's more similar to what you just mentioned. And this theory posits that a thing isn't actually a thing or a composition of parts, but only a perception of the mind observing it. Therefore, it's only an organizational structure that has continuity in the mind of the perceiver. And so this is an example of extreme subjectivity, of course, and it only addresses human perception, not human independent external reality. So this takes the analysis to an entirely different level, and also makes things more confusing, because then, you're really talking about perception and that being the most important thing. So you could literally have, as you mentioned, the sailors on the ship. You could have each person perceiving it in a different way, and that's regardless of the actual external reality of whether the ship is still identified as the ship of Theseus or it's become something new over time. But the important part is the perception. And that's where we'll allude, essentially, this is alluding to the internal versus external debate, where is identity really just something that, when you're thinking about yourself, is it more important, or is it essentially your main identity based on what you think internally and your perceptions of things? Or is it equally, or maybe more so, important to look at how other people perceive you and your actions and your words, and that becomes the identity? Because really, there's just one you, but you interact with many people during any given day. There's so many more people, especially then when you go to a national stage, you're a politician, you're a rock star. That identity that you put out there is being perceived by so many more people, and therefore, is that external identity then, is that more real than your internal identity? So yeah. So any thoughts on the cognitive science take on that?
Well, the whole internal external thing is kind of one of the first things I think of when the question of identity comes up. So it's interesting. We're going here next. I think there's a part of me that wants to say, who cares what anybody else thinks? It's important what you think of yourself. But the reality as you move through life is that you're gonna a lot of what's going to happen to you is going to be based on what others perceive of you. If you think about like job situations and just even interactions in society, right? You can think you identify as one thing or portray yourself as one thing, but a lot of it, what matters is how other people interpret that, and how other people, and especially in a lot of cases in society today, how other people react to that. Now, I want to say in a healthy sense, it only matters what you think of yourself. But when I say that, I also think about how hard people try to portray an identity about themselves that I don't even know if it's necessarily accurate, but it's definitely what they want other people to think about themselves. I think there's a lot of things, again, I'll say in the workplace where that probably becomes true. Like if you're, trying to get a promotion or something, you definitely want the people who are in control of that promotion to think a certain thing about you, right?
Absolutely.
You're trying your best to make it true. At the very least, you want someone to believe that it's true. But I think about that in other parts of society too. And, not to pick on anybody in particular here, but I think about it with like vehicles and all the people that drive, you've heard me talk about this before, all the people that drive these big jacked up Jeeps around, sure, they may be fun to drive. That's cool. But like, you're kind of portraying an image that you have this off-road lifestyle, that there's a reason you have a Jeep, but they never see any dirt on them, right? It's like, I think you want somebody to think this about you, but it's not necessarily what's accurate. You know what I mean? But that's, to each their own. But it's just an observation I make as I go through society. It's just like guys who, soup up their, little cars with all these extra racing parts and stuff. Is, well, I don't know if you actually race that car or not, but you sure want people to think that you do. You know what I mean? So, so I don't know there. It's I think both are important, but I think just real quick on something else I kind of touched on too. I think we ourselves, as we're looking at other people, we there's certain regards where I think we do need to respect that identity that they, I'm thinking in a lot of cases like LGBTQ situations.
Mm-hmm.
If someone says I'm living my life this way and here's what I want to be called and here's the pronouns I use, my personal opinion is we can do our part to respect that, respect that too. Because
Yeah.
as someone who I've not struggled with my identity in that way, but from a confidence standpoint at certain aspects of my life, I've struggled with what identity am I putting out in the world. I think once you start to you're struggling with that and you start to become comfortable with something, you really hope other people are gonna kind of respect that as much as possible.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely want to touch on the medical and psychological aspects of this a little more in a few minutes here. I think that is just, it also kind of complicates things because that opens up a whole can of worms that we can get into. But I think that's a very important part of identity because that is also kind of the combination of physical and mental things that go into who you are and then also then who you are perceived to be as well. But I think you make a great point there, and I think to me extend what you're saying there. It's as long as there's really no harm being done, I think it's important to do our best to respect that identity that people put out there, even if it's a manufactured identity and someone's trying to be something or portray something that maybe you wouldn't expect otherwise. But I still think it's important to do our best to give that some respect and try to accommodate that. And I also think too, going back to what we were talking about a little when we first started, was I think oftentimes, and you mentioned the workplace being a prime example of where you might want to portray a certain identity or a motivation, or to make it look like that you're ready for that promotion kind of thing. I think oftentimes, in my opinion, it's more about repressing elements of identity rather than specifically trying to put out certain elements of identity, especially in the workplace where you may think certain things that you're just not going to say because you're afraid of what that that could cause some issues, or you could get into some uncomfortable conversations, or our identity is made up of so many different things that to really fully express that would be maybe kind of scary, or get you into situations where again you're getting into conversations that just might not be appropriate or might be again a little bit off-putting to certain people. So I think from my perspective, I think a lot of it is just as much what you hold back versus what you do put out there.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. I didn't think of that initially, but you're spot on with that. Kind of the on your best behavior idea at work, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're not maybe not talking about too much about maybe certain things you do on the weekend, or you know what I mean. Um, yes, no, that's a really good point.
Yeah. Yeah, another going back to some of the other theories around how you could interpret the ship of Theseus experiment would be, I'll add one more in there and then we can move on to because it kind of ties into another aspect of identity and then how it's handled in society, is the continued identity theory, where if components are replaced over time, then it's still thought to be the same thing. But if most major components are destroyed or replaced at one time, then you would think of it as a new thing. So it's really by the degree to which changes are made and the timing on that. So, for example, to take this in a different way, someone has a traumatic brain injury where there's a major change in personality or behavior. Then the question is that a new person? Um, is that essentially a new identity based on those major changes, and especially happening based off of one event rather than slowly changing over time? Because I think we could both argue that we would still maintain essentially the same identity. It may be made up of different things and we may have different interests, but if we change slowly over time, hopefully most people are changing by degrees over time and becoming more of the person they would like to be, becoming maybe more patient, more understanding, all those things that we would hope evolve over time. But then if there is something like a TBI where you have these major changes all at once and drastically affects your personality or behaviors, then would that be, according to continued identity theory, that would probably be considered a new identity. And I'll give you some examples here and then we can discuss it. In 1848, Phineas Gage was working on a railroad construction site and a steel rod accidentally got fired through his brain, damaging his prefrontal cortex. And people that he knew said that his personality changed dramatically and he became more aggressive and impulsive. He had no lasting physical damage that you could see other than the scars on his face where the rod went through, but basically became to his friends and family a different person because of the changes to his personality. Another example is Bobby Joe Long, who, when he was growing up, he suffered multiple severe head injuries. He also had some interesting behavior where he slept in his mother's bed into his teenage years. Later, then when he was in his 20s, he suffered another major head injury from a motorcycle accident. And when he was in the hospital, he experienced blinding headaches, impulses of rage, and sexual frustration. Later, he would go on to rape more than 50 women and tape himself killing 10 women over a period of just 7 months. And then when he was finally caught, he was tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. So that leads me to then the question, which is a really tough question, granted. But should someone who has had a TBI or things like that be held to the same legal punishment standards as a person without that, who has the ability to judge right from wrong and control their impulses? And so, since major changes to personality and behavior is a common documented thing post-injury, and they seem to be unable to control themselves in the same way they could before, should we have the same legal standards for people who commit crimes after such an injury? Your thoughts?
Wait, you're coming out heavy tonight. Well, I don't know if I have an answer for that one right off the bat. I think I'll kind of skip ahead. I think regardless of the legal, reactions to that, I think you'd have to, as a society, though, stop it from happening. Right? Mm-hmm. You can't go, oh, that's just Bobby Joe Long. He bumped his head a few times, and now he's all rapey. Old Bobby. Right? Yeah. So I think regardless, you'd have to figure out how you're gonna keep that from happening.
Yeah.
I think that kind of gets into the whole insanity plea in a way. I guess if you'd have to argue that he's no longer in control of his actions and his decisions based on that. Well, that's a that's a tough one. But just on the idea that someone's identity like that could change over time. I mean, I was glad to hear you touch on the idea that we as a intelligent species we should change over time. We don't want to be exactly the same our whole lives. The first thought I went to was the transition that someone who decides, well, I don't even want to word it that way. Someone that doesn't feel that their physical body they're born with represents the gender they associate with, right? Someone knows them as as a younger person, say as one gender, and then they go through a transition to another gender. When they transition to the gender that they've always identified as to and express an outward representation of that, that's a similar type of massive identity change, it seems, not so much from their perspective, but again, as we were talking internal, external before, from the way society would need to accept them and recognize them in what would feel like to them, to the external world, a new identity, right? Even though it's
Mm-hmm.
the identity that the person probably always identified as. It seems like that's the closest thing to a on the scale of a massive identity change that someone might experience with a head injury. So the idea of are they a different person? I don't know. In that case, they're even different for themselves, right?
Yeah.
It's not like the other example where that person always identified one way and then now they're expressing it differently to the world. For that individual that has a TBI, it actually would be a change for them too. So that's a really good question, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe they are. Maybe they technically are truly a different person. That's an
Yeah.
interesting question.
Yeah. And there's a lot of, I think that one in particular, there's a lot of more, societal impact type of ramifications to how that is answered. And I'll give my thoughts on that. I think for the first point you made, that's spot on. We can't, especially with someone that has no impulse control, then the prefrontal cortex is the primary area of reason and logic and impulse control. So if that area specifically is damaged in a significant way, then you may still know right from wrong, but you just can't do anything about it. You may just have a thought that appeals to you and you just do it. And so if someone's living like that and they do bad things, I think you have to take them out of society. And where I think, and this may be a little controversial, but I think it's not like in the Bobby Joe Long example. I don't think he should have been sentenced to death. I think he should have been in a hospital for the mental health facility, a secure mental health facility where he can live his life. He's not going to be punished for something he couldn't control. But essentially, and I'll get into this a little bit later too. I have some examples on insanity and dissociative identity disorder and how that shows up in the courts and how that's evaluated generally by different court systems, like in the U.S. and the U.K., for example. So we'll go into that a little bit more in detail in a little bit here, but yeah, I don't think it's fair to say someone who literally has no control over their actions should be punished in the same way as someone who theoretically does have control. And I also think that the insanity defense is more about, to what you were wondering about there, I think it's more about knowing the difference between right and wrong and then being able to use that. So, insanity generally being that you don't realize what you're doing is wrong, so therefore you can't be punished in the same way.
With Bobby Joe Long though, like how did they how did they prove that he really couldn't, tell right from wrong at that point? Like, because that seems like it could be a slippery slope of,
Yeah.
I didn't know what I did was wrong, right? That's, there's a lot of people who've tried that over the years, but how do they prove that in his case?
Yeah, and I think in that case, what I'm advocating for is more on the basis of lack of ability to control his actions, not necessarily knowing if what he was doing was right or wrong. So he could be perfectly aware that you know videotaping and killing those 10 women was very wrong, but his impulse control wasn't there. It just wasn't available to him, so he had no control over. He had no ability to stop himself, and so that's where I think the distinction is maybe from a criminal perspective, from a legal perspective, not valid. But I think from just a uh, way to evaluate it in a more common sense way or a, you know, common parlance way of looking at it, not legally, I think it's important to say, you know, the person that was there before, the Bobby Joe Long previous to that, wasn't doing those things. And then after the traumatic brain injuries, then he started behaving erratically, behaving more violently, sexually deviant, all that stuff. So then, should he be punished with the death penalty for doing something that he had no control over. So I think that's where the distinction that I'm making is.
Yeah, I guess I'm still a little sketchy though on like how did they prove that he had no impulse control?
I think in that case, and I would need to do a little more research to see the arguments that the prosecution made versus what the defense said, but I'm guessing they leaned on the fact that you could literally do brain scans and see the activity in the prefrontal lobe, prefrontal cortex versus a normal brain scan, and showing that because he had documented injuries to his brain, that he no longer had full function of those parts of his brain that allow for impulse control.
Okay, so they were
So
actually able to like medically prove there was a change in the functioning of his brain. I don't think you said
yeah,
when that was. What time frame was that in? Do you know?
uh, not too long ago. I think it was maybe in the '90s, early 2000s.
Oh, okay. Because the first
So
example you
yeah,
gave was 1848, so I was thinking maybe this was a little older. So okay,
right.
more modern technology at play there.
Yeah,
Okay, gotcha.
yeah. So at least like CT scans and things like that were available, and then also I imagine they would have had interviews with family and saying like this is how he was before the injury, and then post motorcycle injury he started behaving erratically. He started doing X, Y, and Z. So just that sort of anecdotal evidence of massive behavior changes as well.
Okay, yeah, I just wondered what
Yeah,
the I not thinking there was a lack of evidence, but I was curious what the how they were able to make those conclusions.
yeah, yeah. Um, so so I guess yeah. I mean, I think it makes sense then now to since we're on kind of that particular subject. I thought we would dive into another interesting thing that we've talked about here and there before about dissociative identity disorder, and I'll just give a quick kind of definition just to set the stage of what that is. In the DSM-5, it's classified as quote, the presence of two or more distinct identities or personality states, each with its own patterns of perceiving, thinking, and relating to the environment and the self, where at least two of these identities or personality states recurrently take control of the person's behavior, end quote. And also, they noted that they can often perform differently on personality and IQ tests, as well as even have different handwriting. So there are distinct physical and personality based manifestations that are different based on each alter within that person. So generally, it got me thinking about when trauma changes the structure of your mind and results in multiple separate identities. Typically, to cope with trauma, that's the most common cause of dissociative identity disorder. It's not a genetic disorder, you're not born with it, but most of the often it's trauma that creates the different identities. And then so then that makes you wonder, are those identities simply a part of that original person, or actual new people who happen to inhabit the same body? In terms of just how you look at and how you identify the alters, are they all, do you think of them as individual people, again, who just happen to occupy the same headspace, the same physical body, or is it just one identity that's fractured and has unique components within that an individual person? So that's one question. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that yet. There's other things that I want within this particular subtopic here, but I don't know if you have any thoughts on that so far.
So whether or not they're actually different people
Yeah,
occupying the same body. So it seems like in most cases, at least in most representations in movies and stuff that you see, it seems like there's always one sort of like base, like the kind of the original person is sort of like the like if you're how do I want to say this, like if they're if there's a crime situation or something, like when they're dealing with the what they consider to be the original person or the actual person, it's that original personality. But the idea of could the others be considered completely different people? I think if they were able to function independently without the relationship to the others, perhaps I'd feel maybe a little more like that. Like if,
Mm-hmm.
like if you didn't always have to get, and again, I'm going by movies and TV, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I'm not as familiar with a lot of the actual situations, but if that, if one of those personalities was able to take over and kind of be the main, the primary personality, then I guess I'd feel more strongly. But I don't have a firm position here. I mean, I could certainly be coerced, because if I think about the ideas of like, does our soul exist despite our body? And does our, if you can start getting into ideas of like reincarnation and things like that, where maybe multiple, your soul lives multiple times in different physical manifestations and things like that, could the opposite work, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
um, like what if your body didn't die and you just kept getting your new software downloaded into it, right? Which was different personalities. I mean, I guess it'd certainly be possible, I'll say. A lot of people might question that, but if it were to happen all at once, it's just like if you have a, like an Apple computer that you also run Windows on sometimes, right? If you're running a whole different operating system within within that environment, it's still the same computer. So I guess
Mm-hmm.
so who am I to say it's not possible that they are truly different people?
Yeah, and I should also add that there are two primary, as far as my understanding goes, there are two primary forms that dissociative identity disorder takes. One being where the primary uh, then has distinct alters, but then they share memories and they all have awareness of one another. And then there's another type that perhaps I believe a little less common, where each the primary and the alters still meet the official definition, where they take control, they have different personalities, they manifest different ways, but they are distinct in that they don't share memories. There's essentially like blackout periods where the primary identity loses time, basically, and while the other identities are in charge. So there's no shared memories there, at least consciously. So those are the two main types. And I think that, although I don't know if that really adds any clarity to the question of, are those different people
I feel
at
like
all? But
I feel like maybe a little, because I would say that based on what I said earlier, I think the second type would fall more into what I would think of as different,
mm, mm-hmm,
But I think that tie of, to the first type, having the same memories, having, have experienced some of the same things, or at least maybe, um, if one personality technically experienced something that had the trauma, and then sometimes what and there's a TV show on Apple. We're not sponsored by Apple, everyone, but it was called The Crowded Room, and it was a crime situation, and I think I was telling you a little bit about that one before, but like that was definitely a case where the multiple personalities were helping the original one, or the alternate personalities, maybe is the right term. They were definitely helping
mm-hmm,
the original one cope with some trauma and his upbringing and things he'd experienced as a child. That seems like it's more like different, just kind of lenses and perspectives on the same life, I guess, is maybe what I'll say. But it was interesting, though, just how um, separate they did seem, though, the way it was portrayed in that show. Like at one point, the detective or the psychologist that was working with the police, on the crime, were actually, they had to talk to at least one or two of the alternate personalities to understand more about the original personality. So she would
mm-hmm,
literally be like, "Hey, I need to talk." I can't remember the names in the show, but I
mm-hmm,
need to talk to so and so, and it was not, you know, and it was there when she was starting to kind of starting to understand that. I think the psychologist in that show actually understood that he had multiple personalities before he did. Right? He was still kind of in
mm-hmm,
denial of it, and she was actually pulling it out of him. And as she started to realize that, she was like, "Oh, I need to talk to so and so," and then because like the alters all understood that they were alters, right? The
right.
original didn't understand that the alters were all part of his same, same scope of personalities. So It's pretty interesting.
Yeah. So that's almost like then you might, in a simplistic way, and again, not a clinical way at all, but in a simplistic way, maybe the first aspect where the primary identity is aware of the alters, they share memories and such. Maybe in that case, just to super simplify it, it would be maybe where the primary is still main identity, and there really isn't multiple identities. There may be alters, but they're essentially aspects of the main identity, and so they could all be considered essentially part of still that main identity. Whereas the second type could be more easily construed as multiple identities inhabiting the same body because they are independent and they do operate independently. They don't share memories. So there's really no crossover. So in that one, it would be easier to say that that would be considered multiple identities. Because I think the word personality doesn't necessarily mean, to me anyway, it doesn't mean an entirely different identity. It's a strong aspect of identity, but I guess for this case, for this example, I think that might be a useful way to look at it. To then further explore that, if one of the other identities commits a crime, should then they be punished in the same way as a person without the disorder? Um, is the original primary identity any more real or culpable than the alters? So if you put one alter to prison for a crime they committed, you're also punishing the other alters in the primary that didn't do anything wrong. So that makes you think about, can you detain and treat a person against their will in a mental health facility to deal with that disorder, especially if one or more of the alters are violent. So again, that kind of gets to not only should you hold someone accountable in the same way as someone without DID, and or can you make a case to keep someone in a facility where they can't do anything? And so that's a very similar, to me anyway, that's similar to kind of the Bobby Joe Long thing, where if you have no control over your impulses, it's a different sort of accountability question. If you have alters that are violent or disruptive or aggressive, but more specifically, like an actual threat to yourself or a threat to other people, would you be justified in detaining that person, that physical person, regardless of the alters, and just to ensure that there is no chance that an alter couldn't take control and do something criminal?
Well, what do you think about that?
That I think it's a similar answer to the Bobby Joe Long thing, honestly, where in terms of, and it's difficult too because there really is no treatment for either case, other than there's no medical treatment. There's therapy. I know with DID, most often it's serious talk therapy where the clinician would try to reintegrate the other, and that's primarily with the first type that we discussed, where they're aware of the other alters and they can kind of bring them forth, maybe not at will, but more easily than the other type, where it's just sort of it switches and they're not aware of the switch. But where in a case where the person is aware of alters and they can be coaxed forward, like you were saying, almost in that, like in that example of that show, where the detectives were trying to get to more information and they had to talk to the other personalities, the clinician would try to reintegrate them to create that whole primary identity again that brings in the other identities that were created to deal with the trauma. And so you go back and you talk about the trauma, you talk about why identity X, Y, and Z, are there and how they experience it, what their role is. Are they the protector? Are they the abuser? Are they, it's interesting when you start to dive into this, all the different aspects that show up in these different altars commonly anyway. And there's some through lines in a lot of the cases that I've read about. So it's very interesting. So I would say it's much easier to see a path forward with the first type of DID, less so with the second. And so I think that would be part of the equation. But I still think in either case, if there's a serious, credible threat of safety to either the person themselves or to other people, then I think you have to involuntarily detain and try to treat them as best you can, even if there hasn't been a crime committed in that case.
Yeah, I think that's kind of where I was leaning too, but I guess I wanted to hear you say it first. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a tough call, but I think you probably
Yeah.
have to protect society as
Yeah.
much as you can, right? Because you can't, yeah, you just can't
Yeah.
put people in society at risk. And unfortunately for that person, if they can't, if they don't have a lot of control in that situation, yeah, you have to probably detain and treat as best as possible.
Yeah. And I mean, I think we've come a long way in general in treating mental health, situations, mental health issues. It used to be that you would, if you had a serious case and they didn't know what was going on, you might just get a lobotomy or you might get shock treatment until you turn into a vegetable. If you had anxiety really bad, you would just be sent to a convalescence home and kind of just removed from society. Or if you were, I was watching some interesting information on eugenics, and there was this guy that created this scale of, like, I can't remember the three exact. He used three different terms for levels of intelligence, like idiot, moron, and imbecile. I think were the three, based on the levels of comprehension or the age ranges that your mental intelligence were. And then that would go a long way once you took the test and you were determined, let's say, to be a moron, which might be like, early teenage years or like late 10 to 12 age range. Then you would have a certain treatment program where you might be sterilized or stopped from breeding and that kind of thing. So we've come a long way since treating people in that way. And I think being overly cautious and just removing people from society, and rather than dealing with the problems, just taking them out and putting them in a facility and forgetting about them. So I think regardless, I think, it's obviously great that we've understood a lot more about the mind, a lot more about the brain, the physical brain, and conditions like that we're not just acting based out of fear alone, and actually, good information, or better information all the time, I should say. I will throw in one more thing. When thinking about if there's a crime that's been committed in this case, part of it also is even just the competency to stand trial. And if the primary identity is not aware of what the alters are doing, and some of the alters appear during a trial, is that grounds for considering the person incompetent for trial? Or, if, again, you're taking someone that has no awareness, so there is not a question of right and wrong, but it's just not even knowing. You could just interview someone and they just would have no idea what their alter did. How can you treat that person the same way, punish them the same way, because, or despite the fact that they are aware of what was done with their body?
Yeah, you'd have to literally. That's a really interesting point. You'd have to literally be able to put the alter on trial that committed the crime. If you go out and shoot somebody, you can't put me on trial for it and expect me to speak for what you did, right? It's almost okay. So now that's interesting. Now are we starting to get into the idea that maybe they technically are two different people if one can't fully represent the other because they're not technically one and the same? Well, maybe we've swung the pendulum on that answer a little bit. It's a very interesting point.
Yep. Yeah. And that, so yeah, admittedly, that's a very difficult thing to answer there, especially when you get to the actual legal situations where it feels like, from what I've read, that the U.S. in the U.S. court system, it's very, very unlikely that using your, even a patient or a defendant that has dissociative identity disorder can use that as a valid legal defense. It's almost never recognized, and it's almost never successful when tried in court. But in the UK, that has shown some success. However, they are almost always then remanded to a mental health facility where they're, monitored, treated, and secured. So I think, kind of based on, or closer to our take on, having to remove them from society to keep themselves and others safe, but not throwing the book at them and just putting them in a prison and, calling it good. And I know, I guess, to move on a little bit, you've already touched on gender identity a little bit, and I thought I would kind of give a couple quick definitions for people that don't know. I mean, the most common ways that people think about this are gender dysphoria and body dysmorphia. Those are two very common examples, where gender dysphoria is a condition where one's gender assigned at birth doesn't match their own perceived gender. And body dysmorphia is a condition where one has a distorted view of their own body. But I think they're both interesting in different ways because, the gender identity thing broadly, I think, is a really hot topic right now. There's a lot of strong opinions, a lot of strong feelings about it. You see it come up in political debates. You see it come up in sports debates. It's just really, really controversial. But I mean, and also, I guess, just throw out there that sex and gender are different things for people that aren't clear on that. Biological sex is one thing, and that's even not a binary. It's not just male or female. There are people that have both sets of gametes, both sets of genitals in some cases. It's not just a pure binary. And there are also, with gender is essentially a social construct. And so it's how you present to the outside world versus, in some cases, then how you feel internally. And I think, one of the things that I thought of when you were talking about it earlier was that, that transition from presenting externally one way to presenting a different way, the way you've always thought of yourself. But then the first thing I thought of was just how difficult and how painful that must be to suppress that, for those years, however long it takes for someone to say, to feel comfortable enough to finally say, I don't want to be like this anymore. I feel that I'm a man, and I, as a woman, but I feel like a man. I was born in the wrong body, and now I'm going to present as a man, and I'm going to take steps to get there. But then to have to, kind of tying into what we were saying before in the workplace, like, part of the identity that you don't share is oftentimes more prevalent than what you do share. And so that just, it has to be just I don't know, incredibly awkward, potentially, and painful, and just wrong feeling to have to just keep that inside and not be able to express yourself in the way that you really truly feel inside. So I don't know. It's just, I have a hard time imagining how much of a struggle that really must be.
Yeah, I was just looking up on my phone because I wanted to find. I read an article the other day about Elliot Page and a new movie that he has coming out, and I believe, if I found it, it's called "Close to You," and it tells a story of basically someone who went through the same process that they did. Kind of realizing that they, were potentially, and I apologize for any words I don't get right here, but not potentially born in the right body, and wanted to go through a transition, and in the article it talked about how cathartic that process was to kind of get to granted he's playing a character in a movie, but he's getting to kind of
Hmm.
tell that story of, that pain you go through, that fight for acceptance you go through. I believe in the movie he, comes back to his hometown after being gone for a while and basically having gone through the transition, and then seeing a lot of people that he hadn't seen since, for quite a while, who last saw
Hmm.
him as a female, and now they're
Hmm.
kind of re-meeting him in a way. It's the same person inside, right? But it's presenting a lot differently. So I'm anxious to see that, because I think it's important for all of us. A lot of people are quick to judge and make decisions based on how that whole idea makes they themselves feel. But I think it's important for us that maybe haven't had to experience that to understand what it is that someone goes through in that situation. Like you said, I can't even imagine, as someone who's, like I said, gone through life with maybe not as much confidence as I always would have liked to have, carrying around a few more pounds than I'd like
Hmm.
to. And just even in that regard, not being able to represent myself in the way that I would like to, that's just a
Hmm.
fraction of what I think someone like that must be going through, to really just feel completely different than what it's been given to them in a way.
Hmm.
You know what I mean? So I just, I
Yeah.
think the best, more perspective we all could get on something like that, I think the better we'd be off as a society to, just figure out how to treat people better as a whole.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, just offering people that grace and empathy of you never really know what it's like to walk in someone else's shoes, and even if you could try a little bit at a time, that's a huge step to take. And one thing I wasn't so sure I was going to bring this up, but I've as you know, I've struggled with mental health for a long time, and I've had various issues and diagnoses, and we'll probably dive into that in more detail at another point. But it as I was reading some things from Robert Anton Wilson about he and Tim Leary um, were kind of contemporaries, and I think this is Wilson's concept specifically, but both of them kind of shared the idea of reality tunnels and the idea that we should be agnostic about everything because we don't really know. All we really have is our perception. So each one of us, all 8+ billion people on this planet, each have their own reality tunnel, and you can change reality tunnels. You can switch reality tunnels to see what it's like to occupy someone else's or some of their ideologies reality tunnel. But where I was going with that initially was when I'm feeling balanced and quote unquote normal, I have one reality tunnel that's based on all of my experiences and general perceptions and ideas. So I view things one way, and then when I'm depressed, when I'm going through some serious issues mentally, I have a completely different reality tunnel. And so that gives me a good sense that you can be in the same body, you're in the same mind, but you can literally perceive things completely differently depending on circumstances. And so, that fact that for people that identify as a different gender as they were, assigned at birth, that's a reality tunnel that doesn't match up with that external view of them. So that reality tunnel is different than that external identity that they've been perceived as, or other people's reality tunnels view them. And so that dissonance between the internal identity and the external identity, to circle back on that, I think that's a really big part of one, I think, a lot of misunderstandings and a lot of prejudgment that we do as people, but that it can oftentimes be harmful because, we just don't really know what's going on in someone else's reality. And if we took a second to ask, to be curious, to keep an open mind, and really try to explore and try to do our best to say, hey, I want to get in on that reality that you have too. I want to, even partially from a selfish perspective, where you want to have other experiences, you want to grow as a person, you want to be more understanding, but it also shows that people that you want to see them. You want to really understand them, not just physically see them, not to just perceive them in the way that you already had going into the situation. So I think that's important to consider too.
Yeah, and as you talked about that, I think about how much I can go back to some of the things I said earlier in this conversation too. But like, people are constantly trying to change their own reality tunnel, right? Someone goes on a diet to lose weight. Someone, like you said, seeks treatment for depression or anything along those lines. They're trying to sometimes change their reality tunnel, sometimes improve what their reality tunnel
Mm-hmm.
is like for themselves. And so I've lost weight different times over the years. It feels great. It's something that I understand that I'm basically in control of, and I can do. Sometimes quicker than other times I do it, but it's something I know is within my power to change. But if you think about like gender dysmorphia or the things you mentioned, you most often need some help to change that, right? And so we need
Mm-hmm.
to make sure that help is available to people and that we understand that we can do that. And I know people who, man, this is probably going to sound terrible when I say this, but man, they'll go pop Ozempic to change their, their reality tunnel for their weight and things like that. There are medical
Mm-hmm.
purposes for Ozempic. I know it's for diabetes, but I'm saying there's a lot of people out there that are taking it just for the weight loss benefits, but
Right.
will frown on somebody else who in a more extreme case needs to change their reality tunnel from living from a man to a woman or vice versa. You know what I mean? But they're willing to pass judgment. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
But they'll, like I said, go pop a pill in a heartbeat to go drop 50 pounds. Yeah, you're definitely spot on. And if we could just
Yeah.
become more understanding and accepting of those things, we'd definitely be better off.
Yeah, agreed. So I think we're getting pretty close to wrapping up here, and I wanted to throw one more example out there, and this really touches on again more that internal versus external identity and reality. And it's another kind of controversial example, but I thought it was a good one to end on. You may remember a woman by the name of Rachel Dolezal. That was her previous name anyway. She's changed it now to Nkechi Amare Diallo. She was a woman born to white parents who identifies as black. And she was a former NAACP chapter president for about a year. She resigned after controversy over her racial identity. Growing up, even into her teens and I believe early 20s, she started darkening her skin. She permed her hair, used ethnic hair products, really tried to change her external appearance to match the identity that she believed internally. So before we discuss, let me quote from a Wikipedia article here. On June 11th, Jeff Sell and Maureen Dolan of the Coeur d'Alene Press published an article entitled Black Like Me. The article reported that Dolezal had made claims in the media and elsewhere about her ethnicity, race, and background that are contradicted by her biological parents. The article went on to outline Dolezal's past hate crimes allegations of being abused with a baboon whip by her parents, misrepresentations about her race, and misrepresentations about the identity of her father. The article further stated that Dolezal, in a recent interview, quote, maintained that she is African American. They can DNA test me if they want to, she said. I would caution you on all of this. This is ridiculous, unquote. Ruth Ann Dolezal, her mother, was quoted in the article stating that her daughter's allegation of being abused with a baboon whip was a very false and malicious lie, adding that it was disturbing that she has become so dishonest. And so I think this is interesting because I think it really is a prime example of that internal versus external identity. People were perhaps rightly questioning the identity that she was putting forth because they knew she had white parents, so she claimed that her father was a black man, even though her actual father was white and her mother was white. And I think the main point that I'll end this my part of the intro here on is I think it's fine if your internal identity doesn't match the external identity that people see when they look at you, when they talk to you. Where it becomes a problem is if there's any sort of grift, if there's any sort of manipulation going on. She apparently had accused a bunch of people and made claims about various hate crimes against her, saying that it was because she was black, and essentially co-opting that identity to gain sympathy, to gain attention, and to advance her personal career. So that's where I would say it can become an actual issue of concern, because it's that identity was being then used as, or weaponized is, I guess, a good way to say it. So that's where I think it can become a problem in this case. If it wasn't for all of these, the controversies and the allegations and the misrepresentations, saying her, different people were her father, etc., in order to further her goals, I think it would have been fine. Maybe unusual, but I'm not one to say that we have to conform with society's norms all the time. I think there's perfectly fine norms and mores and things that generally society is deems acceptable and okay, but I don't think everyone has to just go along with all that stuff all the time. I don't think that's necessarily what I'm saying, but I do think it's a problem in this case. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, so as you were describing, that whole situation, what went through my head based on things that were said earlier in this conversation is it made me wonder if she did have some sort of, stressor or some, traumatic incident in her life. And maybe she's not lying about the abuse that she suffered. It sounds like it's a bit of a, two different people stating two different opinions. Now I was scrolling the Wikipedia article just as you were talking there, and the one thing I did come across in the personal life section is she has stated she's been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. It doesn't go into what exactly from, but if that was something from early in life, maybe this whole thing is similar to some of the other folks that you used as examples in this conversation, and maybe this is her reaction to to something that traumatic that happened early in life. It's hard to say there. You know what I mean?
Right.
Yeah, it's an interesting case though.
For sure, and I hesitate to say that it's like the gender identity issue, in that you feel like you're something different but trapped in a body that's not really yours, like you're just in the wrong body. um I'm not trying to equate those two things, but it seems kind of similar in a way, just at a high level. um
Yeah, similar, but I mean, gender's kind of, I don't want to say a flip of the coin. I mean, I know there's more that goes into it than that of what determines, what gender you are when you're born, but it's a little different when you're talking family lineage, through history, where your ancestors came from and didn't. I mean, that's a little more cut and dry, although I know, for a lot of people it gets I don't want to use the word messy, but I mean with a lot of different, if you had different ancestors that came from different places, and as they got married and stuff over the years, or had children over the years, it could be from all different places, just like people who find out they're 1/10 Native American, or things like that. Just so it's not as cut and dry, but it's a little different than, it feels a little different than gender, in that, like I said, there's more that goes into play of what you would consider your ancestry to be versus your gender, which is probably not as open to, the people that came before you doesn't necessarily determine what your gender.
Right. Although I could argue that race is also a construct as gender is. Um, race is essentially an invention. We're all just apes,
Well,
really.
yeah, that's probably a whole conversation for another day.
Yeah, that's a whole different can of worms. But yeah, so I think we had a good discussion here. I really think, I don't know that we came to any novel conclusions on internal versus external identity. I think, other than the fact that I would say we seem to agree that they are both important. I would end on maybe leaning towards internal identity being more important, because at the end of the day, you have to live with you. When we talk about reality tunnels, for example, then it's how you perceive things. That's your reality. And so your identity has to come from within. And it can be perceived many different ways, but I think at the end of the day, you have to live with you. So that's
Yeah,
the
and
most
I'll tell
important
you,
thing.
to me, there's nothing better than seeing someone walk down the street just being who they are. You know what I mean? Whether it's somebody who's, maybe a little more flamboyant or whatever it is, when you see somebody truly being just, they don't care. You know what I mean? What you think of them. I look at that person, I go, man, that actually must be nice. You know what I mean? To just not care what anybody else thinks. So I think I agree with you there that I think your
Yeah.
individual or your internal is probably more important.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, fantastic. Everybody, thanks for joining us. That'll wrap it up for today, for this week, and we'll catch you next week. Thanks for joining.